At the party, people were already watching me when my husband said I was being dramatic. Right in front of his friends and their spouses, my phone was still open on the table. My mother calling again and again while he laughed and told them to ignore it. No one stepped in, no one asked if something was wrong, they just watched me sit there, holding the screen that kept ringing, waiting for someone to care enough to say her name out loud and make it stop, but instead, the silence grew heavier than any voice in the room. Everyone, I still remember the way the room went quiet when my name was mentioned, not because it was important, but because it interrupted the rhythm. Everyone had settled into, glasses clinked, someone laughed too loudly, and a chair scraped softly across the floor. My husband did not look at me at first. He kept talking, finishing his sentence as if nothing had changed. Then he glanced over just once, like he was checking a detail he already understood. I was standing near the table, my phone in my hand, the screen lighting up again with my mother's name. She had called twice before, and I had stepped outside to answer both times. But this time I stayed. I don't know why I stayed. Maybe I thought it would stop ringing. Maybe I thought someone else would notice. No one did. Raised his glass and said something about how people get too sensitive, how small interruptions can feel larger than they are. A few people nodded, a couple smiled. One person avoided my eyes entirely. The conversation moved on around me, but I stayed in the same place, holding the phone that kept vibrating against my palm. The screen dimmed and lit again, each call stacking on the last, like someone knocking from the other side of a closed door that no one intended to open. He looked at him then, really looked, not the version of him I lived with every day, not the quiet mornings or the routines we shared, but the version that existed in that room, surrounded by people who saw him as confident, steady, in control. He didn't seem angry, he seemed certain. Certain that whatever I was dealing with could wait, certain that my hesitation was unnecessary, certain that my silence meant agreement. Amin asked a question about work, and he answered smoothly, shifting his attention without hesitation. The moment passed for everyone else. For me, it did not. I could still feel the vibration of the phone even after it stopped. Like my hand remembered what the screen had already shown. My mother's name stayed in my mind, not as a call I had missed, but as a presence that had been set. Asade stepped back from the table, careful not to draw attention, and moved toward the hallway. No one followed, no one asked where I was going. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet. The phone rang again. I answered, this time, my voice low, steady, but already changed in a way I couldn't explain yet. And on the other end, my mother spoke in short breaths that didn't match the calm I had just left behind. He stepped into the stairwell to hear better because the hallway felt too open, too exposed for what she was saying. Her voice trembled between sentences, and each pause stretched longer than the last. I asked her to sit down, to breathe slowly, to stay on the line with me. She tried to answer, but her words kept breaking apart behind me. The party continued, muffled through the door, laughter rising and falling like nothing important had shifted inside that narrow space. The air felt different, thinner somehow, as if everything in my life had quietly started moving in another direction without asking me. First, he stayed there a moment longer, listening to her breathing, realizing I could no longer pretend that what I was feeling was temporary, or something that would resolve itself by waiting. I knew that night didn't end when the call did. It followed me home, settled into the quiet spaces between routine sounds, and stayed there longer than I expected. My mother's breathing had steadied by the time the ambulance arrived, but the uncertainty in her voice didn't leave me. I kept replaying her pauses, the way she tried to speak but couldn't always finish a sentence after we hung up. I sat in the stairwell for a while, staring at the wall, not moving until my legs felt stiff and unfamiliar. When I walked back into the room, the conversation had already shifted. People had moved on to lighter topics, inside jokes forming again, laughter returning in fragments. My husband glanced at me briefly, then looked away as if confirming that whatever had pulled me out was no longer relevant. He didn't ask what happened, not then, not later that evening. He simply assumed my absence had resolved itself. Left together an hour later, riding in the same car, sharing the same silence. The drive home was long enough for questions, but none were asked. I remember watching the passing streetlights reflect across the windshield, each one appearing and disappearing at a steady rhythm that felt more consistent than anything between us at that moment. When we arrived, he went inside first. I stayed in the car for a few extra seconds, holding the steering wheel even though the engine was already off inside. I checked my phone again. No new messages from him, no acknowledgement of what had happened earlier. But there were updates from the hospital number I had saved after calling emergency services. I read them twice, slowly, making sure I understood each line. My mother was stable. She would be monitored overnight. The words should have brought relief, and in a way they did. But they also made space for something else to surface, something quieter and harder to ignore. The days that followed, Small moments began to stack up, each one revealing something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. It wasn't just that he didn't respond that night, it was how natural that choice seemed to him. How easily he returned to normal conversation afterward, how little curiosity he had about what I experienced while I was gone. There were earlier signs. Now that I was paying attention, times when my needs were deferred without discussion, moments when decisions were made without including me, then explained afterward as if agreement was implied, conversations that ended before I could finish my thought. I used to tell myself those were just habits, things that came from routine or stress, nothing intentional, but looking back, they formed a pattern that I had quietly adapted to over time. I began to notice how often I adjusted my own expectations before speaking, how I would pause before asking for help, reconsider before bringing up something important, choose words that felt easier for others to accept. I didn't realize I was doing it at the time. It felt like being considerate, like keeping balance, but now each instance felt connected, part of something that had been building without interruption. On evening, a few days after the party, I mentioned my mother again, not in urgency, just in passing, as part of a normal conversation. He nodded without looking up from his phone. There was no follow-up question, no pause that suggested he intended to engage further. The moment passed without friction, but something inside me registered the absence more clearly than the response. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with confrontation or emotion. It was a realization that had been forming quietly, confirmed not by what was said, but by what consistently wasn't. And once I noticed it, I couldn't return to the way I had understood things before. The boundary didn't happen all at once. It started as a quiet decision I made without announcing it to anyone. The next time something came up that required support, I didn't wait for permission to ask. I didn't rehearse my words. I didn't soften the need just to make it easier for someone else to receive. I simply said what was necessary and let the response be whatever it was going to. Bite felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into a space where the rules had changed without warning. I remember standing in the kitchen one afternoon, holding my phone after making a call that mattered to me. I had asked for something small, something practical, but the answer I received was delayed, indirect, and ultimately dismissive. In the past, I would have adjusted, rephrased, or accepted the outcome without question. This time, I didn't. He placed the phone down and stayed where I was, not reacting outwardly, but paying attention inwardly. The silence in the room felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was revealing. I could see how often I had been waiting for clarity that never fully came, and how much energy I had spent trying to interpret intentions instead of responding to actions. That same evening, a conversation began that should have been simple. Plans were being made that affected both of us, but I noticed decisions were already leaning in a direction that didn't include my input. When I asked a direct question, the answer came with a tone that suggested the matter was already settled. There was no openness to adjustment, no space for discussion, just a quiet expectation that I would align with what had already been chosen. He didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to convince anyone otherwise. Instead, I listened carefully, not only to the words being said, but to the structure behind them, who was being considered, who was not, and where I stood within that structure. For the first time, I allowed myself to see the pattern without immediately trying to fix it. I had spent years stepping in, stepping back, adjusting my expectations to maintain balance, but balance only works when both sides are participating in it. In that moment, I realized I had been maintaining something alone. Later that week, a situation rose that required a clear response from me. It involved a commitment that I had previously agreed to, but circumstances had changed, and continuing in the same way would have meant ignoring my own limits. I explained